Kake, who's Ngā Kui, and Te Paro Whao, me Ngāti Ko, Te Aroa, and Whakatohia. And Jade and I had the pleasure of sitting, well, I had the pleasure of sitting with her, but the meetings weren't so pleasurable, in a very large research grouping, and she was a star, and so I've been very interested in her work before and since. She's an architectural designer, a writer, and housing advocate based in Whangarei. Her design practice is focused on working with Māori organisations on their marae, papakāinga, and civic projects, and in working with mana whenua groups to express their cultural values and narratives through urban design. She has written for a variety of housing and architectural magazines and contributed chapters to several books on architecture and urbanism. Rebuilding the Kāinga will be her first book and is published by Bridget Williams Books. Is it out or is it? Not yet. It's a treat in store. So this is a taster of the ideas here, and you'll be aware that Kāinga has been attempted to be copyrighted by the government, who's now said no one can use the word Kāinga because the new ministry covering the Housing New Zealand, HLC, and various other organisations is going to be Kāinga Ora, so we're really complaining about that. Because this seminar is hosted by He Kāinga Ora, the Housing and Health Research Program, and the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities. Over to you.
Yes, the book is not out yet. When I first got invited to speak here, I thought that it was coming out in June, so I thought it would be quite nice timing, but we've pushed it out till October. So as Philippa said, it's a little bit of a preview of what's to come and a summary of some of the ideas that I've been exploring in this text. As Philippa mentioned, I work as a designer in Whangarei, predominantly on papakāinga, marae, whenua development, projects with Māori clients, but I also do quite a bit of work with our hapu entities, supporting the integration of our narratives, values and aspirations within major civic projects and through urban design. So this seminar discussion is kind of a culmination of a lot of my work that isn't design and more focused around things like policy and research. Because when I studied architecture, I realised that architecture alone wasn't going to address the social issues that we had or the aspirations that we had. And so I got drawn into this whole interesting world of advocacy and policy and research, mostly because the work that I wanted to be able to do for my community, I wasn't able to do, and there were still so many barriers for us. So anyway, without further ado, I'll get into the talk. So as Philippa mentioned, I'm from Te Parawhau Ngāti Hau in Whangarei, from Ngāpuhi, but I'm also from Ngāti Koe in Te Arawa and from Te Whakatohia over in Opotiki. But I live in Mairohe in Whangarei. I guess I wanted to start with sketching out a bit of a vision or a thought that I had a few years ago. And this is actually the wrong view, because the thought that I had happened on that island that you can see in the image there, and I was looking out at the whenua from which I'm taking the photo in this example. The reason I didn't show that photo is because I didn't take a very good photo. I was quite sort of caught up in the moment. But I was looking over at our ancestral whenua from our tupuna pā site on Matakohe, and I was thinking about the plans that our whānau had made to develop our land and I guess bring our kāinga back to life, because this place was where our grandparents were born and raised, and it had been an active kāinga up until the late 60s and into the early 70s, but nobody in our whānau had been able to live there for the past 50 years. And so I was quite excited about the possibility of us actually being able to live there again, how things had started moving. And so I was looking out over the harbour and thinking about, wow, you know, in the not too distant future, we're going to be able to live how our grandparents had once lived. And then I was looking around at the other places around the harbour where there is still active kāinga, or where I knew kāinga used to be. And I thought about how maybe in the next 50 years we might have the opportunity to re-establish our kāinga and live together as whānau. and live on our whenua, and how different our lives might be as a result. And so I didn't have an image of whangare, and there's a number of really great historic images, but pretty much most of our images of our kāinga look something like this. Usually something like raupo or niko, whare, not intended to be long lasting. And generally we had maybe 3 kinds of settlement pre-colonisation or during early contact. And so there were our kāinga, which are our unfortified villages, which were generally sited to be located close to resource sites. We also often had fortified pā associated with kāinga, to which the hapu could retreat in times of conflict. And we also had seasonal encampments associated with makinga kai, so things like fishing villages. I did not know I had automatic timer on, sorry about that, it's progressed. So this is an image that I think most will be quite familiar with, and this is the pattern of Māori land loss. And I show this image, although many have probably seen it repeatedly, to demonstrate just how rapidly whenua Māori went out of Māori hands. And the image on the right is 1939, but actually it's not much better now. There are very small amounts of land returned through treaty settlement processes, but generally they're not returned to whānau or hapu who suffered those direct losses. And I'll talk a bit more about the treaty settlement context shortly. And a lot of those lands are specifically allocated for commercial uses to help to rebuild that tribal economic base. So there's not necessarily the possibility of occupying those lands. So what we're left with is a tiny 5% of the landmass that's quite difficult to develop, with many barriers, which I'll talk through a little bit later, and a limited recourse for Māori landowners and whānau to re-establish those kāinga in which we used to live, or at least in a contemporary sense. Which brings me, I guess, to the treaty settlement context. Yes.
Just to turn that automatic thing off so you don't have to...
That would be helpful. I don't know. I must have said it, and I don't know how to undo it.
Don't worry, we can sort that out.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Sorry, people.
No, I do appreciate that. It's helpful because I keep flicking back, which might be a bit distracting.
We don't have to rush you.
Okay, thanks.
We're enjoying it. Yeah.
Anyone want to ask a question? Environmental mindfulness.
Oh, I can keep talking while we fix that, actually. Sorry, I was wondering, how did I do it? How are we fixing this? But I can learn that another time.
So we're removing this advanced slide after 45 seconds. We're just removing that.
Thank you.
And that should allow...
That's really helpful.
We save that.
So I guess, as we're all familiar with, as the land back, so after the signing of Te Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, and preceded, of course, by the signing of He Whakaputanga in 1835, the settler population increased exponentially, the Māori land base decreased rapidly, and there was a mass, especially after World War II, there was mass urbanisation and shifting of Māori, mostly Māori, rural Māori populations to the cities. So our pattern of occupation has really changed a lot, with the majority of us not necessarily living in our tribal areas, with our land base very much diminished, and with Māori really overrepresented in a lot of negative statistics, particularly in relation to housing quality and housing ownership and so on. And so we're at a really interesting point in time, with the Waitangi Tribunal having been established in 1975, and some of those early post-settlement entities like Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Whātua ki Ōrākei, or more recently Ngāi Tahu and Waitakato Tainui, now being more than 20 years post-settlement and being significant economic forces within their rohe. But as we hear, that's not without its challenges. With, I guess, one of the common criticisms of this post-settlement environment is that, well, yes, it's really great that we are now in a position to rebuild the tribal economic base. A lot of these entities are very powerful in their rohe, and some of them have really progressive social programs that have seen the benefits, those economic benefits, start to translate into social benefits. But some would argue that the iwi is too far from the whānau and hapu, and perhaps it's not the right scale for economic activity. In Ngāpuhi, we've paid pretty close attention to what's happened elsewhere, good and bad, because as you would know, we're pre-settlement and we're still on that journey. So we went through our first inquiry in Ngāpuhi, which was Te Paparahi o Te Raki, Waitangi 40, the stage 1 inquiry. And that stage 1 inquiry was really important because it demonstrated that Ngāpuhi never ceded sovereignty. That's a finding that the Crown isn't willing to engage with, and that's probably the main reason why we're not able to, well, one of the main reasons that we're not able to progress with our treaty settlement at this time. Even though the media reporting makes it seem as though Ngāpuhi just can't get it together, and you know, there's all these stories that are kind of like, aren't you tired of being poor? Don't you just want to get that settlement across the line? But not if we don't actually want that, or a lot of us don't want that if it means that our sovereignty is at stake. You might have seen in the media recently that the minister was there on the weekend trying to kickstart negotiations. But a sticking point is that the Tūhoronoko mandate has not been withdrawn, despite going through an evolved mandate process late last year where 70% or 70 out of 110 hapu voted to reject the evolved mandate, which means that that's not a settlement vehicle that's going to work for us. And so we're kind of in this position where treaty settlements might not actually provide the answer if indeed they have for others. Certainly we don't think that it will for us. And so a lot of my energy has been really focused around the small scraps of Māori land that we have left and how we can exercise our hapu rangatiratanga and reoccupy that whenua and rebuild those kāinga. It's not going to solve all of the problems because, as we know, there's a 5% amount of land. It's quite small. I think in Whangarei district it might be around 40. But I think that it provides a really compelling starting point. I've thought a lot about the reasons that we struggle to make decisions as hapu and struggle to make decisions and operate politically. And I think it's because our political and economic unit was centred around our kāinga. So we lived and worked there, and we shared resources at that level as well as trading with other kāinga. And we were able to make decisions because we all pretty much lived together in kinship groups. And so to ask people that are no longer living together and maybe spread across the country or as far afield as Australia or even further than that is a big ask, I think, as that Evolved Mandate Challenge really demonstrated. And so in my mind it's not, I don't know that it's a good use of our energy to be putting a lot into the iwi political space, and maybe others have different views, or be putting a lot of energy into the treaty settlement space, and again others will have different views. And so I guess I wanted to next talk a little bit about some of the barriers to re-establishing our kāinga on our whenua. So this is a 2011 document by the Office of the Auditor General, and unfortunately a lot of the findings are still hold. So this report showed that there were still substantial barriers, and these were things like access. So a lot of Māori land is landlocked. There's no legal access. A lot of Māori land is really poorly serviced by infrastructure. District plan provisions are another barrier. So most Māori land was zoned rural or countryside, and it meant that instead of being able to have these multi-dwelling kāinga, you could just have one house per 10 hectares and maybe a secondary dwelling for a share milker. So it really limited what you could do with your land. Not to mention that a lot of these land parcels have been whittled away to be so small that they're either not economic or they actually are too small to be developed under the prevailing district plan rules. Thankfully, a lot of those things are changing. So places like the Western Bay of Plenty, Tauranga Moana, Heretaunga, and I think Waikato are starting on that journey, and of course Whangarei, all have quite progressive district plan provisions. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the things that we're doing in Whangarei and some of the possibilities that have been opened up due to our papakāinga plan change. And I guess the other major barriers are owner decision making and governance. So a lot of Māori land blocks do not have legal management entities. And it's a very long process sometimes to form one, especially when there can be hundreds of owners. So for one of our land blocks, even though we'd had continuous occupation, we'd never stopped using it or living there within at least some parts of the family, it took us 8 years to form a trust, and we had about 12 meetings. And it takes a long time for everybody to agree that this is the right thing to do, and then to generate enough evidence so that the land court will approve your application. We had to go to court twice, and it wasn't even a contentious issue. And we're an organised whānau with some really good professional skills. So if it took us that long, if your family is perhaps not as united and you have troubles communicating with each other, or you don't actually know the other owners, that can be a really, really long process. Some of the other barriers are just around governance skills. So having, getting that right balance between whakapapa, so a lot of blocks will often kind of centre around whānau lines, whether that be siblings or grandparents or whoever, and then people with the right skills to manage the land or develop the land. And the biggest issue, in my view, is access to finance. So if you're looking to develop whenua Māori, because it's communally owned and it cannot be sold, or there are some limited ways it can be sold, but for the most part it can't be sold, it means that the bank can't use the land as security. And so unless you have alternative security, be it a piece of general title land or some kind of asset, you're really limited in your finance options. And so far they haven't been willing to accept things like forestry as an asset, which is one of the few assets that some of our Māori land blocks do have. And so you're pigeonholed into this singular product called Kāinga whenua, and it's basically a Māori version of the Welcome Home Loan. And so it's a social housing product with a Māori name for whenua Māori. And the main difference is that the home has to be able to be physically removed in the event of a default, which just seems crazy. As far as I know, that's never happened, but the underwriting is quite risk averse and doesn't enable you to build on slab if that's what you want to do. And I don't know if they're planning to do something about this internally, but currently they've capped the prices at $1,600 a metre squared, which is really no longer relevant. So I think that reference price might be from 2016, and you really can't build anything for that now. The last time I talked to my QS that I work with, he was saying probably 4,000 might be a bit more appropriate for what we needed to do. So we wouldn't be able to access that product and build the housing that we're designing currently. But perhaps the good thing that's on the horizon, although I don't know what's going to happen with this, is that Kāinga whenua is going to go over, I believe, to Kāinga ora. And so hopefully that means that there's actually some reform underway, because it's been a failed product, and there's been calls from the Māori housing sector for a long time that it needs to be reformed. So you want to develop your whenua, you've got all these barriers, and there's one finance product, and it's really very limiting. I wanted to say one more thing about this, and that's my cousin on the cover, and I think it's quite, I don't know, it's just quite funny all these years on, because his kids are quite big now, he's got grandchildren, but this was back from 2011. Anyway, that's a nice photo. So sorry, just for context, hopefully it doesn't autoplay. I've pulled together a couple of examples that kind of speak to the aspirations of Māori landowners, but also some of the challenges. And I just thought I'd speak to these two projects a little bit. So the reason it says Indigenous urbanism is I did a really fun podcast last year, and me and my cousin travelled around the country and went to lots of different projects and interviewed some really amazing people. And so I thought I'd just play a few really short audio clips from there and then talk a bit about the project, if it works. Yes, it did.
My whole Māori valley. What if all the Māori land that is still owned and multiple land ownership that's being leased to farmers, what if we took all that back and it was all grown in permaculture gardens? Therefore, none of our valley would be hungry. What if we had all of these houses in here and we all lived collectively as hapu or whānau units and hapu along our road? We would be so rich in every way.
So that was Aroha Shelford, and their project is out in Mangakahia Valley between Whangarei and Kaikohe. Now you heard Aroha speaking, and it's a really beautiful vision, and it's a hard vision. I mean, they're aware that there's a lot of challenges. And the great thing when I went and interviewed Aroha is that she was really honest about what those challenges had been, because she wanted to share with other Māori landowners going down this path so they could understand what some of the challenges and pitfalls they're likely to encounter might be. Now for this project, they chose to construct their homes with earth. That was a barrier because I have some views about whether earth is really suitable as a construction method in this country, but that aside, there's very few engineers locally that understand the material and know how to work with it, and the council also didn't know how to work with it. So they had engineers who told them that they could do the work and then actually couldn't, so they wanted to stick a bunch of steel all through the buildings, which obviously increased the cost. And then we had council being very risk averse and not wanting to take that risk because they don't understand this technology. They also had the challenge that although they're in Whangarei district, the plan change hadn't gone through yet. It was a two-phase plan change, so the kind of overall intent was there, but the actual rules weren't. So it meant very little for them in effect. And so they had to go through this really awkward process where they have to ask permission from their neighbours, and some of them had probably held the land almost continuously since it was either, illegitimately obtained, whether it was sold or confiscated. And a lot of those neighbours were farming properties that are doing really quite environmentally damaging things. So it can be really marmite to have to go and ask those people for permission. And I know that was really hard because they're just wanting to come home to their papakāinga, and yet there's all these roadblocks and they have to ask the very people that may have benefited from the loss of their land whether they could come and build here. And of course those neighbours don't necessarily want this kind of thing to happen or don't necessarily understand it. They also had some challenges because now I don't know all the details about this, but their Ahu Whenua Trust was in the process of getting set up, so that's the land management entity, and so they had to umbrella the project under a whānau trust. And I think things are okay now, but I think it did hold them up because the entity that was managing the putea and the project wasn't actually the landowning entity, and that whānau trust didn't, although it was on behalf of the wider group, didn't formally represent that wider group. So again, I think there was some tensions within the whānau for that reason. And it's the Māori land legislation really setting us up to fail, in my view. So that's that project, and I think that they had a tough year with the papakāinga last year, and things were held up, but I believe that they're back on track now. But I guess it encapsulates so many of these projects where the aspirations are really necessarily very big, and it's a wonderful vision, but it's really hard. It's really hard, and there's a lot of challenges. This is another project. This one's in Heretaunga, and I think Waiōhiki, yes, Waiōhiki in the Hawke's Bay.
Seeing our houses on our whānau land right next to our marae, and all our children, my siblings' children, playing together and growing up together. It's almost winding back time, like at the park site at Otago Park, just across the road from us, how our tipuna used to live, with their own whare, all these communal areas. It's like reversing the colonisation process or the urbanisation process. We've been enticed back to our land and our stories and our history. Those aspects of our life are now strengthened by being at the close to the park site, which is now our workplace. Next to the awa, which we grow native trees for, that we beautify the river's edge. It's all encompassing.
So that's Hinewai Ormsby now. She just got married. She rang me the other day. She's like, it's Hinewai Hawakirangi, but it's Ormsby now. I was like, oh, congratulations, that's lovely. So she's really inspiring wahine. She's pretty much driven this project through despite getting told no about 10 times from various agencies. So her and her siblings inherited this block of whenua Māori, and it was one of 3 in a row opposite the Marae, but because it had been whittled down over time, it was too small to be developable under their district plan. And so what she did is she located the owners of the neighbouring 2 blocks and I believe one was a whānau trust and one was a karawa. And I think the whānau trust had previously tried to sell but hadn't been able to find a buyer. So she talked to both of them and said, would you be interested in selling? And here's our whakapapa link. I think both of the other two owners did not have aspirations to live or build there, and so they were on board. And she went to the Māori Land Court. She had spoken to one person earlier who said yes, that can be done. She went away and got owner consent. Came back and she spoke to a different person who said, oh no, you can't do it. You can't buy Māori land. And she said, but your colleague told me that I can. You need to go away and figure this out. And so she, the woman did, and she did get the right outcome. But she'd walked off the street, and this person just, without even checking, said, "Oh no, you can't do that," because the person at the Māori Land Court didn't have the technical knowledge to understand the interpretation of the Act. And if she was somebody who took no for an answer, maybe she would have walked away then and there. A few other things happened with this block, so they went through that process. And she developed a valuation methodology that was fair based on the size of the land, that it couldn't be developed, that it was Māori land and so on. And she was able to negotiate the sale and then have the sale and purchase agreement prepared to go to the Māori Land Court. The next barrier was when she wanted to raise finance to purchase the land. And so because it's whenua Māori, she couldn't get conventional bank finance. But what she was able to do was use her mother's land, which is on general title, as security so that they could then purchase these other two blocks. But then they had to write an agreement that said that her mother was pretty much just gifting the security, and that if they defaulted, she would have no rights to the land because she doesn't whakapapa there. So it was an incredibly complex process just to secure these other two blocks. And so they were going through the process of purchasing the blocks, and then they were also applying for money from Te Piri Kōkiri, and these two things are moving along, and they're going, oh, okay, well, I hope they both come through, because they could have been left with, didn't receive the pūtea, but managed to buy the land, and then they've got a mortgage they need to service without being able to progress the project. Or they might have got the pūtea, but oh, whoops, we only have one block of land that can't be developed. Thankfully, they both came through, but it was probably a pretty harrowing few months waiting to see what was going to happen. And so they had to jump through all of these hoops and get told no a bunch of times. And it's only because she's the person that she is, and she was so, was so determined and wouldn't accept no, that they managed to progress this project. And now they've got, this was taken when it was still under construction, but they now have 3 homes, and there's room for another 2. And so they live there on the papakāinga. Their marae is across the road. Hinewai's a marae trustee. O Tātara Pā's just up the road, and her husband run a Māori tourism business. And so they take tours up the Pā site amongst other places. And then their whānau is also involved with riparian planting and environmental initiatives along their awa. So it's, in my mind, a very holistic vision and a holistic outcome. And as she said it in the audio clip, they're living how their tūpuna might have done, and they've been enticed back to their whenua. But they had to go through a hell of a lot just to get to that point. So those were, I guess, just, I hope, 2 illustrative examples of the vision and the challenges, which is true for most of these kind of projects. Now I wanted to talk about a few international projects, because I had been thinking a lot about this finance issue and the barriers that, in particular, and the barriers that we have. And then in 2017, I was fortunate enough to lead a group on a bit of a study tour through Canada and the United States. And through talking with people there in advance of that trip and while we were there, I guess I was alerted to some potential solutions that we could look to adopt the thinking here. So this project's Puyallup Place of Hidden Waters, and that's in Tacoma. I think it's in Tacoma. I did go there. I'm just not very familiar with the geography, but it's in Seattle area. And this one's interesting because they had this kind of small block of land that had become quite urbanized. Well, the city had kind of grown up around them. and they have had an existing sort of gymnasium, and they had some existing townhouses. But they went through this development process where they created these kind of new longhouse typologies that had like a kaumatua unit and then a larger unit on the other side, and this atrium that runs through the middle, which is on the next slide. And then they also renovated the townhouses to be kind of consistent, and then they renovated the community centre, so they've got this really wonderful gathering space. But when they were going through this process, people were saying that, oh, you know, it's going to kind of bring down the property values and all of the things you often hear around Māori development. And the kind of uncomfortable irony of that is when they did this beautiful development, it actually raised the property prices in the area. And then when there was land for sale, the tribe couldn't afford to purchase it. So I wouldn't call it self-gentrifying, I think that's too strong a term, but it's just kind of interesting that actually that was the outcome. But it's a really interesting development, and I think that the focal point around the community centre and how they sit within an urban context is kind of different to anything that we have currently. This one is a project called Divine Legacy Native American Connections, and this is in Phoenix. And it's like a mātāwaka sort of pan-tribal urban Indigenous organisation, so it's not affiliated to any tribe. And it's multi kind of residential. There's a variety of typologies through this apartment block, and there's a variety of communal spaces. And this development was financed through the Low Income Housing Tax Credit program, which I guess provides a way for wealthy individuals to kind of get a tax break, but then invest their money into affordable housing. And it means that these low-income developers can develop these kind of projects that wouldn't be able to access conventional finance because it doesn't provide a compelling return. And I'm not sure I fully understand the mechanics of it, but I do wonder, are there ways that our tax system, without providing big tax breaks to wealthy people, but are there ways our tax system could be geared towards funding more low-income development? At the moment, with our community housing, there is no ongoing funding. There's really only the income-related rent subsidy, which you can kind of capitalise up front, which is, you know, kind of useful, but what most community housing providers are telling us is you actually need some capital, and it's pretty hard to access here. And there's been work by some people Paul Gilbert and others, to develop an equity pool to finance community housing developments. And I'm not sure if that's really got traction yet, although the idea's been around for a while and is quite a compelling one. So we're pretty starved of investment for community housing, not just Māori housing, and it would be great to see some more alternative forms of finance. Something I became quite interested in was the idea of this equity pool specifically for Māori housing. And I know that I forget the name of it, but there was a fund that was announced not too long ago, or maybe last year or the year before, looking at an equity pool where post-settlement entities and others could invest, and then that could be accessed for a wide range of initiatives, but it didn't have a focus on housing, and I don't know if any housing projects have been able to access it. But I wonder if the likes of Te Tumu Paeroa were to get involved, as well as some of the post-settlement entities or things like that. Perhaps it could be like an impact investment pool where you get kind of a better rate of return than you would for it just sitting in the bank, but not quite a commercial rate of return, maybe something in between. Anyway, I'm sure other people are thinking about it, but it's been talked about for a while, and it's never really landed. And I know with at least the kind of projects that I work on, where we're looking to develop on whenua Māori, the funding available is quite limited. So there's some money from Te Puni Kōkiri to do all your planning work, your technical work. There's a grant for the infrastructure. There is a capital fund, and it's probably enough to build around 20 homes a year. And typically the subsidies for the vertical build have been maybe 50 to 90%, at least for the first stage of a development. But there's still that other component that requires a loan, and we only have Kāinga whenua, which, as I explained before, is quite flawed. And so I think these, most of these are quite small developments, but if these ever got to any kind of scale, you would need some other form of investment, and I think it's something we need to be thinking about now. And the reason for bringing that up is because perhaps there's ways that we could look at utilising the taxation system. This is a project called Owen Gear in New Mexico, and this one is a pueblo, and it's really interesting because the pueblo is in decline, and a lot of people were no longer living in the traditional housing. And it's kind of arranged in this complex of connected buildings, but there's also courtyards, and I think they have the same degree of kind of spiritual and cultural importance as like a marae atea in the fact that they're sort of culturally patterned spaces, and there's certain tikanga governing how you kind of use those spaces. And the homes are made out of earth, and so they require this kind of, I don't know if it's annual, but this irregular kind of communal maintenance with mud plastering. And so I guess attitudes had changed, and people had become, they'd changed their settlement patterns, and a lot of people had moved into the HUD housing, which is the Housing and Urban Development Department housing. And often these were, 100 by 100 foot section with a home in the middle, detached. And people kind of got used to living in them. And so when there was a move back to the pueblo, something they told us when we were there is that a lot of people found it really hard, especially the younger generation, which seemed really strange to us because they'd only been living next door in these HUD houses, but the behaviours had to be different, and they weren't used to living in conjoined houses. They weren't used to having to treat the spaces around their home with a different level of respect or treat in a different way. And so they were going through kind of a journey of reintegrating back into the pueblo, and it really reminded me of some of the challenges ahead of us, or for those who are already in that position, to moving back into the papakāinga after a generation or two of not living together. I think that, you can finance it, you can plan it, you can design it, whatever, but the social aspects are something you have to figure out together. And something we've been talking a lot about in our projects in the north has been things like, well, actually we're going to need really strict policies to begin with. And, it'd be great to be operating on a tikanga basis, but I don't think that's going to work in the first instance until that becomes the norm again. And so, we're already thinking and anticipating these issues and how we start to address them in an operational way and in an ongoing way. And so the other, there was one other thing on this project. So they also have a newer development that I couldn't get a good photo of. And it's kind of a contemporary version of the pueblo. It's like pueblo-inspired housing, but that one's a bit funny because it's not constructed in the same way. It's constructed in a conventional way to just kind of look like a pueblo, and it's adjacent this existing older pueblo area. But the reason that was worth noting is that they did utilise some of the really interesting finance mechanisms available there. So there's a loan product which is really their equivalent of kāinga whenua called the Section 184 mortgage guarantee. And with the Section 184 guarantee, there are a few things that are different to kāinga whenua. So for one, you don't have to be able to remove the house to be physically removed in the event of a default. And from conversations I had, I understand that was an issue in the beginning, but how they resolved that is by having a 30-year lease term, and the lease is the security, with a 30-year right of renewal. So pretty much if you forfeit and do not meet your obligations, then it's the lease that's up for grabs, not physically removing the house. Something else that works really well there is that they've got something called a Native Community Development Finance, I want to say institute or maybe initiative. It's the last letter is I. And I guess it's kind of like a credit union, but it's the finance available is federally backed, and this is available to kind of mainstream finances, but it's also available to Indigenous organisations. So that might be a housing entity associated with a tribal entity or sitting under a tribal entity. So basically they're able to operate as the bank, which is really exciting because it means that they can access the low Federal Reserve rate. And then what I've heard they're generally doing is that they're offering the mortgage at the same rate the bank would, but the difference, rather than being absorbed as profit, they're able to reinvest back into the community and developing more affordable housing. And to me, that was just such a hugely exciting proposition. Oh, wow, okay. I did not time this well. That's all right. I won't talk about the example project. I'll finish on this part. But yeah, and so I guess I thought about what might be possible here. And I thought about the fact that our land blocks are quite fragmented, and they're actually generally held at a whānau level rather than a hapu level, or maybe at a hapu level, but not under a hapu entity. And it's a real barrier to getting any of those economies of scale that we might hope to achieve. And something I wondered if it might be possible would be if our land blocks that are held within specific hapu, if there was able to be some kind of umbrella entity that wouldn't take away the overall responsibility and rights from the whānau who occupy or directly whakapapa to that whenua, but might be a way that you can achieve economies of scale when it comes to development, when it comes to basic things like management and financial systems. And even if we were to become the lending institution or the finance entity, I think it has to be at a bigger scale than our small land blocks. And it's the kind of thing that is happening in the United States because their land tenure system is a bit different, and a lot of their land is still held at a tribal level, although in trust, and there's other issues with that. Yeah, I guess I wanted to say that although in Aotearoa we often think that we are ahead of the game in a lot of areas, which might be true, when it comes to housing and housing finance and this kind of community development and whenua development, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from other contexts and look to apply not just in our developments and in our community-based work, but also in terms of policy reform, which is really quite sorely needed, particularly in the area of finance.
Why don't you just finish 2 or 3 minutes on your project?
Okay, thanks for letting me. That's nice. Great. So this is just I'll run through it quickly. This is an example of a project that we've been working on, and this is the whenua I mentioned at the beginning. And this is 64 hectares in the central Whangarei area, just south of the port area, and it's the largest block of Māori freehold land left in Whangarei. Here's some beautiful views over the harbour from our whenua. And this is the location. So it's the kind of, if I can operate this, it's that bit. So it's quite massive actually. And this is a photo from the 1960s, and you can't really see it from there, but when you zoom in you can see that there was about 8 homes along the kind of southern slopes of our land. And it connects in with the wider Kāinga of Toitoi, which is to which we always belonged. And there's a photo of our family when we were doing a hangi while we were planting out in forestry. And the reason we put the land in forestry is because there were successive threats by the Harbour Board and the Māori trustee and others who wanted to take our land, and our kaumātua at the time felt that putting it into a productive use was the best way that we could keep it. We've had other issues because of that, but at least we still have our land. There's a photo of the trees and some of our whānau just before they came down. This is directly after it was harvested, and we all camped out here on the whenua. And so we've been through a process over the last few years of developing a land use plan for our block that really reflects the history, values, aspirations of our whānau, but also the constraints of the land in terms of regulatory and land use capability, and so on. And so here's a photo from one of our workshops where we were looking at historic maps and thinking about what used to be there and what's important to us and there currently. Here's one of our maps that we did around sites of significance on the block, and that was the result of that mapping exercise. We also looked at the regulatory and infrastructure, and land use capability, and then we broke the land down into land use zones and looked at potential uses that resonated with what the whānau wanted and what the land was able to sustain. From there we developed a 5 to 10 year vision, so this is our first few projects that we're looking to move on with. Oops, that's one too many, yeah, there we go. and this one, which is a 50 to 100 year vision of what we hope will be there in the future. And the idea that was that it would encompass economic dimensions with our light industrial park at the top left corner there, as well as our social and cultural and environmental dimensions. So the area through the centre is being given over to regeneration of natives and compatible activities like eco-cultural tourism. And then the area along the harbour side is concerned with papakāinga, marae, marakai, with the idea that this really being a self-sufficient, self-sustaining development, so our whānau can live and work on site and can start to have some more of that kind of economic independence and drawing on some of the best from the way our tupuna used to live, whilst also looking towards the future. And this is where we've gotten so far with the papakāinga development. So we've moved on to our stage 1 projects, and now that we have geotech and accurate site information, this is the plan that we've started to pull together. I think I'll leave it there, but I hope that that was interesting and maybe gave you some things to think about. I've got one parting thought and then I'll stop, which is that I'm aware that much of what I've discussed is really rurally focused, but what I have started to think about is now that we have Kāinga Ora being set up and this new Urban Development Authority, I think if the Urban Development Authority works in partnership with mana whenua, there might be some opportunities to successfully bring some of this thinking into our urban areas. And I think the principles are transferable. I mean, a lot of it is really, potentially aside from living on ancestral land, a lot of it is really concerned with living in communities where we're able to support one another, share resources, be close to or integrated with employment, and being able to look after our natural environment. And so I think these are all transferable lessons, and these are not exclusively rural features. So I'll just leave with that thought. Thank you very much.